If words were deeds and ambitions were accomplishments, Kevin Rudd would already be regarded as the Prime Minister of a very good government indeed. Unhappily, they are not. In most of the areas of its clearly articulated domestic and foreign policy plan, its 5 foundations for nation building, its 3 pillars of foreign policy, and also its ideological posture about governing from somewhere called the reforming centre, beyond the old-style categories of left and right, it is, in my view, far too early to make a judgment on the government. We are still, what I call, waiting for Rudd. To get a handle on what the Rudd government has achieved in its first 300 days, I intend to say a few words on the government and the 4 R's to which this conference is dedicated: rights, reconciliation, respect and responsibility. These 4 noble nouns reflect 4 issues with which I was preoccupied during the Howard years: asylum seeker policy, Indigenous affairs, the rise of anti-Muslim feeling in Australia, and climate change. Concerning Rudd and these 4 R's, it is, I think, possible to make some preliminary judgments at least, and as you'll see, they're mixed. If the Howard government is eventually judged harshly by history, one of the reasons will be the astonishment future generations will come to feel about the brutal ways in which it ignored the rights of those asylum seekers fleeing from Saddam Hussein, the Taliban and Iranian theocracy. Of all Western governments, Australia had almost the smallest number of asylum seekers. Of all Western governments, however, we treated those who arrived here, or who tried to arrive, most humanely of all. Before August 2001, we locked even women and children in detention centres, often for years, no matter how deep their distress. We then offered only temporary protection visas. After August 2001, all asylum seekers were repelled by military means, either incarcerated on Nauru or driven back to Indonesia. Not long after this policy was adopted, boats ceased to come. In this sense, the Howard-Ruddock policy, in inverted commas, worked. Now, in his Bonhoeffer essay in The Monthly, Kevin Rudd expressed moral objection to the Howard government's asylum seeker policy. I'm pleased to say that, in general, policy has followed what the sentiments in this article might have led one to hope. Since arriving in power, a great deal of the former government's policy has been quietly dismantled. The Pacific solution has been abandoned. There are no more temporary protection visas. All new asylum seekers will at first be detained only for a brief period. Adults will be detained for long periods only if the government can prove to an independent authority that, in the public interest, the detention is necessary. The only major part of the old system that will be kept is the excision of large parts of northern Australia from the operation of the Migration Act. If any asylum seekers arrive on the Australian coastline, they will be detained not on Nauru but on Christmas Island and will be allowed access to legal advice. I wrote this, by the way, before the events of yesterday. In truth, this new policy is logically nonsensical. Logically. If asylum seekers reach Christmas Island and are found to be refugees, Australia will have no alternative but to settle them. It is inconceivable that other countries will offer homes to refugees already on Australian territory. The hope of the government, if I understand it correctly, is that because of the success of the Howard government's brutal deterrence policy, people smugglers will continue to give Australia a wide berth. The new humanitarianism of the Rudd government's asylum seeker policy is free riding on the success of the Howard government's inhumanity. The Rudd government is gambling on the fact that the shaky logical and moral foundations of their policy will not be tested, and actually yesterday they were. Concerning reconciliation, the picture is more straightforward. The Indigenous policy of the Howard government was based on an astonishingly empty supposed choice. either practical action to attend to the dreadful problems of existence haunting the lives of Indigenous Australians, particularly in the remote communities, or symbolic action at whose heart there would be a national apology delivered by the Prime Minister, in which the non-Indigenous part of the nation would express its acceptance of the profound injustice that attended the nation's foundation, and the Indigenous part would be asked to find it in their hearts to forgive. It was always clear that the reason supplied by the government for their unwillingness to apologise was bogus. The Prime Minister told us time and again that contemporaries could not apologise for the deeds of earlier generations. No one believed that he really thought that the present German government, for example, was unable to apologise for the Holocaust. The greatest moment in the history of the Rudd government thus far was the apology delivered to the stolen generations before the first sitting of the Parliament earlier this year, where Kevin Rudd delivered the only memorable speech of his Prime Ministership thus far. The large Indigenous and non-Indigenous audience listened to each word with rapt attention. When the speech concluded, a vast cheer erupted. It is, as I've written, the sweetest sound in Australian public life that I have ever heard. If there was any false note in the speech, it was the suggestion that we could all now move on. The depth of the dispossession necessarily resists this facile hope. But what is true is this: far from imperiling practical action, the apology created a moral basis which government programs like the Northern Territory intervention had always needed and previously lacked. That the apology will not ensure the success of the practical work is obvious. That it has somehow imperilled their likely success, one of the premises of the former Prime Minister's refusal to apologise, has come to be seen almost universally for what it always was: absolutely daft. One of the most difficult social issues that arose during the second half of the Howard years was the rise of anti-Muslim sentiment. The success story of Australian post-war migration is usually told in the following way. When a new group of migrants arrive, they confront some hostility and suspicion. Through acquaintance, the hostility and suspicion for this group fades. When the next group arrives, the pattern is repeated, and so on. With Muslim migration, the story lacks the normal happy ending. Mass Muslim migration from Turkey, the Lebanon and elsewhere began in the 1970s. Empirical studies suggest that the suspicions and hostilities surrounding Muslim Australians have been resistant to change. I think one of the authors of the study might be in this room. Even more, those underlying patterns of feeling have risen to the surface during the War on Terror. It is obvious that the vast majority of Australia's Muslims bear no responsibility whatever for the rise in tensions. It is also obvious that no matter what any Australian government might have done following September 11, some increased tension between Muslim and non-Muslim citizens was inevitable. From such tension, no Western society has been altogether immune. However, it also seems to me obvious that by its post-9/11 words and actions, the previous government made things worse. The cruel treatment of the mainly Muslim asylum seekers suggested that Muslims in general were somehow unwelcome in Australia. Several government ministers, especially after the London bombings, lectured Muslims on the question of their loyalty to Australia. Blatant racism in speech and writing by government supporters went unresisted and even undiscussed. Anti-Muslim ideologues were even brought here at government expense. I think of Mark Steyn. Twice before the last election, the detention of Dr. Hanif and the attack on Sudanese refugees, a desperate government even sought to gain some electoral advantage by exciting anti-Muslim feelings. Both Coalition and Labor governments had previously seen the official rhetoric of multiculturalism as a means of building ethnic understanding. Gradually, the Howard government not only abandoned the language, but actually began to treat a once bipartisan idea not as a solution to the problem of growing social division between Muslim and non-Muslim citizens, but because it supposedly encouraged ethnic separation as itself a major part of the problem. On all these matters, Rudd Labor conspicuously failed to oppose. I once believed that its silences were tactical and even justified as part of its fierce determination to avoid another pre-election tamper. Unfortunately, since taking power, nothing much on this front seems to have changed. While there is no ground to believe that the Rudd government would be tempted to exploit the Muslim issue for electoral advantage in the ways its predecessor did, I cannot recall an occasion when the Prime Minister has used his considerable authority and his moral suasion to help build trust and respect between Muslim and non-Muslim Australians. So far as I can tell, the new government has followed the previous one in abandoning the language of multiculturalism as an official descriptor of desired interethnic equality and as an aspiration for Australian society in the long term. Commitment to the ideal of multiculturalism was most powerful when it seemed scarcely needed. At the time of probably the most serious ethnic tension experienced on the ground in Australia in the past 30 years, the post-9/11 rise of widespread anti-Muslim feeling, first the Howard government, because of its conservative instincts, and now the Rudd government, because I think of its fear of populist backlash, have allowed the language of multiculturalism quietly to lapse. And like I think Sev from his earlier remark, I regret that very much. Now, having talked briefly on the Rudd government and the human rights of asylum seekers, reconciliation and the respect owed Muslim Australians, I want to conclude with a reflection on how well the government has fulfilled what to me is its overwhelmingly most important responsibility for the continent we hold in trust and even more broadly for the earth. And I must say that my present thinking, all the other issues are being dwarfed. Over the past 150 years, human beings have burned coal and oil deposits that took hundreds of millions of years to form, and as a consequence have sent vast amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Several decades ago, a scientific consensus began to form, which made it clear that this carbon dioxide, in combination with other greenhouse gases, was causing the temperature of the Earth to rise. Scientists warned us that unless we changed our ways, inevitably there would be increasing instances of violent heat waves, floods, permanent droughts, tornadoes. Very large numbers of species would become extinct. Coral reefs would die. The oceans would become increasingly acidic. In the Himalayas, the glacier system, on which 1 billion human beings rely for their water supply, would melt. So would the vast Siberian permafrost. If it did, it would release even more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than is already there. At the poles, the Arctic Ocean would become ice-free. Even worse, the great continental ice sheets, Greenland, West Antarctica, East Antarctica, would begin to melt. As they did, the sea levels would rise not by centimetres but by metres. Since the Industrial Revolution, average temperatures have risen by 0.7 degrees centigrade. Already another 0.6 is inevitable. The CO2 measure in the atmosphere is already higher than it has been in 650,000 years. Unless it is stabilised soon, average temperatures will rise by 2 or 3 or 4 degrees. Models suggest that on a business-as-usual scenario, by the end of this century, a rise of 6 degrees is possible. Long before this, we will have passed the point of no return for the kind of Earth human beings have always known. Nonetheless, in the past 3 decades, despite near unanimous scientific consensus, especially as the industrialisation of China and India has gathered pace, carbon dioxide levels have continued to rise steeply. Recently, these processes, we all know, have speeded up. The ice in the Arctic Ocean is retreating in summer at a pace no one even a decade ago anticipated. For the first time in several thousand years, there is now a northwest passage. What we lack is not understanding, but the courage to face what we know and the energy to act. The we here is human beings. Concerning global warming, the overwhelming issue of our time, let's say as the rise of fascism once was in a different era, the performance of the Howard government was a complete disgrace. The Rudd government came into office supposedly to repair the damage. In the speeches he has delivered this year, the Prime Minister has returned time and again to 2 lines. I've actually read all his speeches. With regard to climate change, his government inherited what he always calls a decade of denial and neglect. And then he says, climate change is the greatest moral, economic and social challenge of our time. What then has the government done to reverse the decade of denial and to meet the greatest challenge of the age? It ratified the Kyoto Protocol. This was costless. It began work on an extremely modest emissions trading scheme. As it began its work, it suggested that the scheme would compensate the worst emitters, the trade-exposed, emissions-intensive industries, and even the coal-fired electricity plants. Ross Garnaut was last year given the task of the reporting to the government. Even though he understands fully the implications of climate science, even though he believes future generations will deplore until the end of time our incapacity to take decisive action, Garnaut has advocated a target of 10% emissions by 2020 if the Copenhagen negotiation is successful, and of 5% it is not, although he thinks we should support 25% if everyone else does at Copenhagen, an almost certainly not to happen event. Essentially what he is saying is that even though the future of the Earth is at stake, Australia should continue to pass into the atmosphere in 2020 as much carbon dioxide as it did 30 years ago. It is almost certain that the Rudd government's target will resemble Garnaut's or even be more modest. Those who think this irresponsible will be written out of the discussion in the language of the new official orthodoxy developed by the Australian newspaper as deep greens. It's the new language. Recently, the US climate scientist James Hansen of NASA, one of the heroes of our age with Al Gore, wrote to the Prime Minister suggesting that we look seriously at winding back our coal industry. Coal is by far the most important source of atmospheric carbon dioxide. We are the world's largest exporter of coal. Our per capita carbon dioxide emissions are close to the highest in the world because of our near-exclusive reliance on coal for electricity. His suggestion, of course, was not taken seriously. The response of the Rudd government to our national coal addiction is rather to promise miserly amounts of money for the conduct of research into clean coal technologies. The search for clean coal is Australia's new Lassiter's Reef. The mirage, however, has a purpose. It operates as a permanent alibi, as an excuse for not changing our ways. It's hard to say these things without appearing slightly deranged, and yet I believe them to be true. Humanity's main chance now for avoiding catastrophe is for individual nations to take unilateral action on carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, in the hope that their actions will have a benign domino effect on other nations and help lead toward a successful international agreement. It would actually be over-optimistic to say that this hope is slim. Despite the fact that our Prime Minister rightly regards climate change as the greatest moral challenge of our era, on present indication, Australia's contribution to the struggle to meet the challenge will, I'm afraid to say, be negligible.